At the Memorial Day barbecue, my son spent the whole afternoon behind the grill, wearing an apron, serving food and cleaning up, while his wife and father-in-law sat back with wine. Then he slipped and accidentally spilled barbecue sauce on his father-in-law's shirt. The man immediately pointed at the mess and yelled, "Get down on your knees! Apologize and clean this up or get out of my house." I stepped forward to defend my son, but he whispered, "Dad, please don't." I walked away feeling powerless. The guests at the tables around the lawn went quiet, their forks suspended, their murmurs dying down in that sudden, awkward way when people are trying very hard to pretend they aren't watching a train wreck. Sienna was sitting at the glass table nearby, her wine glass held by the stem, her eyes cold and completely empty of any warmth. She didn't look at her husband. She didn't look at me. She just stared off toward the fence line, her posture perfect, her silence a heavy, suffocating approval of her father's cruelty. I saw the muscles in Julian's back stiffen under his shirt. He was 34 years old, a man who had built bridges and managed crews, but standing there on that manicured grass, under the hard afternoon sun, he looked like a boy who had been told he wasn't allowed to stand up. The silence stretched until the hum of the neighbor's air conditioner across the hedge sounded like a roar. Victor Mercer stood over him, 61 years old, broad-shouldered and smelling of expensive aftershave, his eyes fixed on the stain on his shirt like it was a personal insult to his entire history. He had spent 8 years as county sheriff before he went into municipal contracting, and he still carried himself like he had a badge pinned to his chest and a law behind him that nobody else was allowed to read. "Well," Victor said, his voice low and carrying that particular gravelly edge he used in courtrooms, "I'm waiting." I took a step forward, my work-hardened boots sinking into the soft turf, my hands curling into fists at my sides. I had spent 44 years welding steel and moving concrete, and I knew what it felt like when a structure was about to buckle under too much weight. But Julian caught my eye, a quick, pleading glance that was so full of shame and exhaustion it stopped me in my tracks. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely making it past his teeth. "Please don't. Just let it be." I stood there, 8 steps away, feeling the cold weight of my own silence sitting in my chest like a block of lead. I watched my son reach for the linen napkin on the side of the grill, his fingers shaking slightly as he dabbed at the sauce on Victor's sleeve, while Victor looked down at him with the quiet, satisfied contempt of a man who had successfully demonstrated his ownership. The next morning, I opened my late wife's old box and found a letter that changed everything. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed the way it always did at 5:45 in the morning, and I stood at the kitchen counter listening to it like it was the only voice in the house worth hearing. Which these days it was. My name is Arthur Coleman. I am 67 years old. I spent 44 years as a welder and construction foreman in Dayton, Ohio, and I have the hands to prove it, scarred across the knuckles, calloused on every pad with a burn mark on my left thumb from a torch accident in 1987 that never faded right. Beatrice used to trace that scar with her finger when we watched television at night. Said it was her favorite part of my hand because it proved I'd survived something. We built this house back in 1982, when the wood was cheap and my back didn't ache after 10 hours on a ladder. Beatrice and I had drawn the layout on a piece of grease-stained butcher paper at the kitchen table of our old apartment on 5th Street, arguing over where the windows should go and whether we really needed a second bathroom. I wanted a workshop in the garage, and she wanted a screened porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the cardinals settle in the maples. We built it ourselves, weekend by weekend, with the help of a few friends from the Union Local who showed up for the price of cold beer and hot sausages. Every joist, every stud, every sheet of drywall had passed through my hands. I knew where the pipes ran behind the plaster, knew the exact spot on the hallway floor that would creak if you stepped on it too hard at midnight, and knew the way the winter light fell across the linoleum in the kitchen at 8:00 on a December morning. This house was the physical shape of our life together. It was the place where Julian had taken his first steps, where he'd scraped his knees on the concrete driveway, and where we'd marked his height in pencil on the pantry door frame until he grew taller than his mother. When Beatrice passed, the house had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the lack of sound. It was the quiet of an engine that had been shut off, the heat slowly radiating out of the metal until everything was cold. For 3 years, I had lived in this silence, waking up at 5:45 every morning out of habit, making coffee in the quiet kitchen and looking at her empty chair across the table. I'd started to think of the house as a museum, a place where I was the caretaker of things that had already happened. I hadn't realized that the walls were still standing for a reason, that the strength we'd built into them would be needed one more time to protect the only pieces of our family we had left. Beatrice had been gone 3 years this past February. I poured my coffee into the blue mug she'd bought at a craft fair in Yellow Springs, the one with the small chip on the handle that I refused to throw away, and carried it to the kitchen table. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch on Clover Street in Westerville, Ohio. We'd bought it in 1994 for $112,000, which felt like an impossible amount of money at the time. We paid it off in 2008. Every room had something I'd built or fixed or repainted with my own hands. The kitchen cabinets I'd installed over a long weekend in 2001. The back porch I'd extended 6 feet in the summer of 2003 so Beatrice could fit her rocking chair and her tomato plants at the same time. It wasn't a fancy house, but it was ours. On the living room mantel visible through the kitchen doorway sat the photograph from our wedding day in 1981. Beatrice in a cream-colored dress, laughing at something off camera, her dark hair catching the light. I'd looked at that photograph so many times in 3 years that I sometimes forgot I was looking at it and just thought she was in the next room. I pulled the calendar off the fridge and checked the date. Monday, May 27th, Memorial Day, 2024. Julian had called 4 days ago to remind me about the barbecue. His father-in-law, Victor Mercer, was hosting the holiday cookout at his place in Springfield, family, gathering the whole thing. Julian's voice on the phone had been careful in a way that made my chest tighten. Not excited, careful, like a man choosing his words around broken glass. "You don't have to come if you don't want to, Dad." He'd said, "I want to come," I'd told him, which wasn't entirely true. But Julian was my son, and that was the only math that mattered. I heard the side gate creak open Gideon's signal that he was coming through, rather than walking around front like a normal person. Gideon Cross had been my neighbor for 25 years, a retired electrician with a gray mustache, and the particular gift of knowing when to talk and when to just sit down and drink coffee. He knocked twice on the back door out of courtesy and let himself in without waiting. "You're up early, even for you," he said, pulling out his usual chair. The one across from mine, the one Beatrice used to say was Gideon's chair, like it had been deeded to him. "Couldn't sleep past 4, I said. "You want a cup, you have to ask." He settled in and waited while I poured. Big day today, the Mercer barbecue word travels fast. Julian mentioned it when he stopped by last week. Gideon wrapped his hands around the mug I set in front of him. "Arthur, when's the last time that boy came home for more than 2 hours?" The question landed somewhere uncomfortable. I looked at my coffee. "He's busy." "So, he's been busy for 18 months. Gideon's voice wasn't accusing, just observing the way a man does when he's been watching something and finally decides to say it out loud. "I see his car pull up maybe once a month, and when he does come, that wife of his is always calling before he's even finished saying hello." I didn't answer right away because Gideon wasn't wrong and we both knew it. In the year and a half since Julian had married Sienna Mercer, something had shifted in the way he moved through the world, or at least through my world. He showed up less, he stayed shorter. He laughed the same laugh, but it didn't quite reach his eyes the way it used to. I told myself it was just marriage adjusting a man's priorities. Reorder when he starts his own family. I told myself that every time he texted instead of called, every time a Sunday dinner got canceled an hour before, because something came up on the Mercer side of things. I'd gotten very good at telling myself things. "You ever met Victor Mercer?" Gideon asked. "Twice at the wedding and at Christmas dinner last year. What did you make of him?" I turned my coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. "He's the kind of man who shakes your hand too hard on purpose," I said finally. Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's one way to put it." He looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Ray, I'm just going to say this once and then leave it alone. Something about the way Julian talks when he mentions that family. It's off." I can't explain it better than that, it's just off. The coffee maker had gone quiet. The kitchen felt very still. I stood up and went to the window. The maple tree in the backyard was full-leafed and green, the kind of green you only get in Ohio in late May before the summer heat bleaches everything pale. Beatrice had planted that tree the spring after we moved in, when it was a sapling, barely as tall as Julian was at the time. Now it shaded half the yard. "I'm going today," I said. "I'll keep my eyes open." Gideon nodded and drank his. He didn't say anything else about it because that was the deal with Gideon. He'd say a thing once, and then he trusted you to carry it. I went upstairs to change into the shirt I'd picked out the night before. Blue button-down, the plaid one I'd worn to the last birthday dinner. Beatrice and I had gone to together. I didn't understand why I'd chosen that shirt until I was already buttoning it up in front of the bathroom mirror. Looking at my own face, the lines around my eyes, the gray that had taken over my hair completely sometime in my early 60s, and I thought, because today feels like a day I need her close. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door. On the mantel, Beatrice smiled at something off camera. I walked out to my truck without looking back. 45 minutes on Interstate 70 heading west. Nothing but flat Ohio highway and my own thoughts. I passed the usual Memorial Day markers, flags in front yards, kids on bikes, a hand-painted church sign reading, "Honor the Fallen." The kind of things you stop seeing until one day you're 67 years old and they hit you all over again, and you realize the years went somewhere while you were busy. I thought about Julian, 34 years old, a civil engineer who'd graduated near the top of his class from Ohio State. He'd gotten that from Beatrice, her precision, her patience with numbers. From me, he'd gotten his hands, good hands, steady hands, the kind that knew how to fix things. For the first 32 years of his life, watching him walk into a room made me feel like Beatrice and I had done at least one thing completely right. Then he'd met Sienna Mercer, and 18 months later they were married, and something between us had changed. In a way I still couldn't find words for. Victor Mercer's property announced itself before I reached the driveway. White split-rail fence, a mailbox with Mercer and polished brass, an American flag that had never actually been in the wind because it was decorative, not ceremonial. I sat in my truck for a moment before cutting the engine. 2 stories, colonial-style brick. Through the side gate, the backyard was already going country music. Charcoal smoke, voices carrying over each other the way they do when people have been drinking since noon. Victor came around the house before I reached the gate. Budweiser in hand, the walk of a man who considered every inch of ground he crossed to be personally his 61, broad-shouldered silver hair trimmed military short. 8 years as county sheriff before construction contracting. He still carried himself like he expected people to step aside. "Ray?" He shook my hand with a smile, aimed more at the 2 men behind him than at me. "Glad you could make it." His grip was harder than necessary. I held it without flinching. He turned to the man and said, "This is Ray, Julian's dad, retired tradesman. The way you describe an old pickup parked next to a new one. Informative, not complimentary." I followed him through the gate. The backyard was larger than my entire property. Teak furniture, a built-in stone grill station, an in-ground pool with a safety net. 20-some adults spread across the yard, and there was Julian, faded blue apron over his button-down sleeves, rolled-up spatula in one hand and tongs in the other. Sweat already darkening the back of his shirt before 11 in the morning. Flipping ribs, turning chicken, adjusting skewers, with the focus of someone who couldn't afford a mistake. My son with a master's degree in civil engineering, sweating through his shirt at someone else's grill. He looked up and saw me. His face moved through relief, shame, an apology before settling into a smile he put on like a coat worn too many times. "Dad, you made it," said I would. I shook his hand and held it a beat longer than usual, felt the calluses on his palm. Not just engineers' hands anymore. Something else was wearing those hands down. "You look tired," I said. "Long week." He glanced at the grill. Victor likes the ribs a specific way. "Where's Penny?" His face warmed, the first genuine expression all morning. Inside was Sienna's aunt. "She's been asking about you." I stepped back and looked at him. He'd lost weight since Christmas enough that I noticed the way you notice a load-bearing wall when something about it starts to look different. Troy Mercer stood at the edge of the patio, beer in hand, tossing a football with a teenager. Sienna's older brother, his father's size, none of his father's presence. He raised his beer at me and didn't walk over. Victor drifted back to his friends near the fence. "Julian," he called without turning around, "make sure those ribs don't dry out. Last time you let them go too long." D.Y.'s jaw tightened for half a second. I'd been watching that jaw since it was small enough to fit in my palm. "Yes, sir," he said, and turned back to the grill. I found a folding chair near the patio edge and sat where I could see everything. The grill, the pool, and the back door where Sienna had just appeared in a sundress phone already out before she'd fully stepped outside. She saw me. Quick smile, quick wave, walked toward the women near the pool. She didn't come over. She didn't check on Julian. I sat in my dead wife's favorite plaid shirt, watching my son work in another man's yard, and felt the first slow burning edge of something I didn't yet have a name for. Nobody told Julian to refill the chip bowls. He just did it. Noticed they were getting low. Disappeared into the house. Came back out 2 minutes later with fresh bags from Victor's pantry, tore them open, arranged them on the folding table near the pool without anyone asking, without anyone noticing, and went straight back to the grill. I noticed I'd been sitting in that folding chair for 40 minutes, watching my son work, and I'd started keeping a mental count. Refilled the chip bowls twice, carried a full cooler of ice from the garage to the pool deck by himself. Ran back inside to get extra napkins when Victor snapped his fingers in the general direction of the house. Stood over that grill in the direct sun while the temperature climbed toward 85 degrees, rotating racks of ribs and chicken thighs with the steady attention of someone who knew what happened if he let his focus slip. Victor, meanwhile, had not moved from his cluster of friends near the fence. His beer had been refilled 3 times by Julian each time, and he was currently holding court about something that kept making the men around him laugh in that particular way. Men laugh when the person telling the story has power over them. Troy sat in one of the teak chairs near the pool, feet up, working through his second or third beer. He'd thrown the football around for a while, but now he was just sitting there with his phone, occasionally laughing at something on the screen. I looked at the grill. Julian's shirt was soaked through across the shoulders now. He rolled his neck once slowly, the way a man does when everything hurts, and he's trying not to show it. My chest felt like something heavy had been set down on it, and nobody had come back to pick it up. Then I heard its small feet on the patio behind me moving fast. Grandpa Arthur Penny hit me at full speed, both arms wrapping around my neck before I'd fully turned around. 6 years old and all momentum, this child, she'd been that way since she learned to walk, just aimed herself at things and went. I caught her and pulled her into my lap, and she smelled like sunscreen and the particular sweetness of a little kid who'd been playing indoors. "Hey there, Bug." I squeezed her tight and something in my chest loosened just slightly. "You've been hiding on me was playing Go Fish with Aunt Cheryl. And I won 3 times. She announced with the total confidence of someone who had never once considered the possibility of losing. "Daddy, look who's here." Julian turned from the grill, and his face did something real for the first time all morning. A real smile, not the careful one he'd put on when he shook my hand, but the one that reached all the way up into his eyes and stayed there. "Hey, Bug," he called across the yard. "You being good for Aunt Cheryl." "I'm always good," Penny said, which made Julian laugh out loud. I held her tighter. Over her shoulder, I watched Sienna appear in the back doorway, screen door half open. She looked at Penny in my lap, looked at Julian at the grill, then looked at her phone. "Penny, come back inside," she called. Her voice was pleasant, not warm but pleasant. Penny's arms tightened around my neck. "But Grandpa Arthur just got here, Penny." Sienna's voice stayed the same temperature. "Come inside, sweetheart." Penny pulled back and looked at me with an expression that was half apology, half 6-year-old frustration. She kissed my cheek with a loud smack. She'd always done that, ever since she was old enough to understand what a kiss was, and climbed down from my lap. "Bye, Grandpa Arthur," she said, and trudged back toward the house. I watched her go. Watched Sienna hold the screen door open just long enough for Penny to pass through, then let it close behind them both without looking at me. To my left, an older woman settled into the lawn chair that had been empty next to mine. 70 or so, white hair cut short, wearing a sensible blouse, and carrying a plate of potato salad she'd apparently made herself based on the way she kept frowning at the store-bought stuff on the folding table. "You must be Julian's father," she said. Not a question. "Arthur Coleman," I offered my hand. "Yes, ma'am. Ruth Garner. I live 2 houses down." She shook my hand with a firm, dry grip. "Victor and I have been neighbors for 11 years. I come to the Memorial Day cookout every year because he invites the whole street and it would be rude not to." She paused. "I don't particularly enjoy it." I looked at her. She had the direct, unhurried gaze of a woman who had stopped worrying about what people thought of her somewhere around age 60 and hadn't missed it since. "Your son is a hard worker," she said quietly, looking toward the grill. "He is? He's been at that grill since 9:30 this morning. I got here at 10. I turned that information over without answering. Victor had a caterer scheduled. Ruth continued, keeping her voice low and even. "Canceled them 2 days ago. Said he wanted it to feel more like a real family cookout." She looked at me, family being a flexible term apparently. Before I could respond, movement near the grill caught my eye. Victor had finally peeled himself away from his friends and was walking across the yard toward Julian. Not the ambling walk of a man going to check on food, but the purposeful stride of a man who had decided something. Julian saw him coming. His shoulders moved a subtle shift, barely perceptible, the kind of thing only a father would catch. Like a man bracing for weather, Victor stopped beside the grill and stared at the rack of ribs. He picked up the long-handled basting brush Julian had set on the side rack and turned it over in his hand. "These have been on too long," he said. "They've got about 10 more minutes," Julian said, low and slow. "That's how you get them to fall off the bone." "I know how to cook ribs, Julian. I've been cooking ribs since before you were born." Victor set the brush down with a sharp click against the metal rack. "Move over. Let me show you." Julian stepped aside. His jaw was set in that tight way again. He handed over the tongs without a word and stepped back, and I watched my son stand to the side of his own task, while his father-in-law took over and began explaining loudly for the benefit of the men nearby who had drifted closer exactly what Julian had been doing wrong. Ruth leaned slightly toward me. "Every year," she murmured. "It's something." I didn't answer. My hands had curled into fists on my thighs without me deciding to do it. I pressed them flat deliberately against my legs. Across the yard, Victor gestured broadly and said something that made the men around him laugh again. Julian stared at the grass. There are moments in a man's life that split time clean in two before and after. You don't always recognize them while they're happening. Sometimes you only understand what you witnessed when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, 2 weeks later, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second. This was not one of those times. I knew exactly what I was watching while I was watching it. By 1, the backyard was at full noise. 20 adults deep into their afternoon beers. Kids shrieking near the pool country. Music turned up louder than before. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce hung thick and sweet in the heat. Everything felt loose and loud and celebratory in the way holiday afternoons do before something goes wrong. Victor had eventually handed the tongs back to Julian and returned to his friends, but not before spending 20 minutes demonstrating his technique to an audience that applauded like he'd performed surgery. Julian had taken the tongs back without a word and finished the ribs the way he'd been doing them all along. I'd watched him do it. I'd watched the muscles in his jaw work the whole time. Now Julian was carrying the finished rack of ribs from the grill to the serving table. A large aluminum tray loaded with full slabs glistening with sauce. It was a heavy tray. He had it balanced with both hands moving carefully across the uneven grass in the afternoon heat, sweat running down the side of his face. Victor was holding court near the center of the yard. Beer raised, telling some story that had 3 men laughing before he even reached the punchline. He turned suddenly, one of those broad, expansive gestures a man makes when he's performing for a crowd, and his elbow caught the edge of Julian. Waxy's tray. The tray hit Julian's chest first, then it tipped, the rack of ribs slid. The aluminum tray clanged against the ground, and the barbecue sauce, thick dark red, the color of old brick, launched itself across Victor Mercer's white Ralph Lauren polo shirt in a single catastrophic arc. The yard went silent the way yards do when something serious happens. Not gradually, all at once. Victor looked down at his shirt, at the dark red spreading across the chest and down the front. Then he looked up at Julian. "You absolute idiot." His voice came out low and controlled, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Julian's face had gone pale. "Victor, I'm sorry. It was an accident. You turned into me. I turned into you." Victor repeated it like the words tasted bad. "You've been carrying trays your whole life, Julian. You can't manage a simple task without making a disaster out of it." His voice was rising now, finding its volume. "This shirt costs $300. $300, which is probably what your father paid for his entire wardrobe." I stood up from my chair. Victor pointed at the tray on the ground, at the ribs scattered across the grass, at the sauce soaking into the dirt. "Pick it up," he said. "Pick every single piece up, and you get down on your knees and you apologize to me in front of every person here or so. Help me, you can walk out that gate right now." "Victor." Julian started on your knees. Victor's voice cracked like a board snapping. Now the yard stayed silent. I counted the people who could have spoken. I counted 22 adults within earshot. Not one of them made a sound. Troy stared at his shoes. Sienna stood near the pool with her arms crossed. Her face turned slightly away like a woman watching something happen on a television she'd already decided not to care about. Julian looked at his wife. I watched him do it, watched him search her face for something. Anything. A word. A step forward, a hand on Victor's arm. Sienna's expression didn't change. Dai's throat moved. He swallowed something down that must have tasted like broken glass. Then he bent his knees. He went down slowly, not dramatically, not like a man giving up, but like a man making a calculated decision about what mattered more than his pride. His knees hit the grass, the sauce-stained ground. He reached out with both hands and began picking up the scattered ribs one by one, placing them back on the tray. His hands were trembling. I could see it from 8 feet away. A fine vibration moving through his fingers that he was trying to control and couldn't. "I'm sorry, Victor," Julian said. His voice was steady. How he kept it steady, I will never understand. Victor watched from above, beer back in hand, expression settling into something satisfied and contemptuous at once. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. He'd already won whatever it was he'd been trying to win. Behind Julian, a man I hadn't noticed before, crouched down quietly. 50s work clothes, a gardener or handyman by the look of him, Jimmy. I'd later learn who'd worked the Mercer property for 6 years. He didn't say a word. He just picked up 2 pieces of rib from the grass and set them on Dai's tray without making eye contact with anyone. A small thing, the smallest possible thing, and the only decent thing anyone in that yard did in those 2 minutes. I was 8 steps away from Victor Mercer. 8 steps and 44 years of knowing how to make my hands useful. Every muscle in my body told me to move. My boots were already shifting weight before I caught myself, before I looked at Dai's face and saw it. Not a plea exactly. Something quieter and more desperate than that. A look that said, "Please, Dad. Not here. Not like this. Don't make it worse." I stopped moving. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs. I breathed through my nose slowly the way I used to count to 10 on job sites. When a foreman said something that deserved more than 10, I stood there and I watched my son pick ribs off the ground with shaking hands, and I did not move, and it was the hardest thing I had done since I held Beatrice's hand in a hospital room and watched the monitor go flat. Ruth appeared beside me. She pressed a cold glass of water into my hand without a word. I took it. I did not drink it. Victor turned back to his friends. Someone laughed at something not about Julian, just the general laughter of a party resuming. And just like that, the world started up again like nothing had stopped it. Julian got to his feet. He picked up the tray. He carried it to the serving table and set it down, and stood there with his back to the yard for a long moment. And I sat back down in my folding chair, glass of water in my hand, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more permanent than anger. Something that felt like a decision being made. 8 steps. I measured it afterward, when everyone had drifted back to their conversations, and the yard had swallowed the whole thing like it never happened. I stood up from my chair, walked the distance between where I'd been sitting and where Victor Mercer had stood over my son, and counted 8 steps, 22 feet, give or take. In 44 years of construction work, I have pulled men out of collapsed scaffolding. I have carried a 230-pound foreman on my back down 3 flights of stairs after a floor gave out in a Milwaukee job site in 1999. My hands have bent rebar-driven steel and done things that would make most people's palms ache just hearing about them. 8 steps was nothing, and yet I hadn't taken them. I was still sitting with that fact, turning it over when I heard Sienna's voice behind me. She had pulled Julian around the side of the house just past the corner, where the fence met the brick exterior. She probably thought no one could hear, but sound travels differently at the edge of a yard bouncing off walls, and I was close enough. "What is wrong with you?" Her voice was quiet, but each word landed like something thrown. "You made a scene in front of everyone, in front of his friends." "Sienna, I didn't. Your dad walked into me. I was carrying a full tray, and he turned without looking." "I don't care who turned," she snapped. "You know how he gets. You know what he expects. Why can't you just be careful for one afternoon? Is that genuinely too much to ask? He made me get on my knees." Julian's voice cracked on the last word. "Just slightly, just enough. He made me kneel on the ground in front of 20 people, Sienna, because you embarrassed him." Her tone didn't soften. "Not 1 degree. You embarrassed him in his own home on his holiday in front of people he's known for 30 years. What did you expect him to do?" A pause. I could picture Julian Unkweiss's face, the way it went careful and controlled when he was holding something back that he didn't trust himself to say. "I expected you to say something," he said finally. "1 word, that's all. I looked at you, and you turned away." "Dear, don't put that on me." Her voice dropped lower. "Don't make this my fault, Sienna. Go clean up and come back out," she said. "We'll talk about this later, not here." I heard her heels on the brick path heading back toward the pool. My hands were clenched so tightly on the armrests of that folding chair that I could feel the metal edge cutting into my palms. I made myself let go finger by finger, made myself breathe. Ruth materialized beside me again, lowering herself into her chair with the careful precision of a woman whose knees had opinions. "You heard that?" She said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "For what it's worth," Ruth said quietly. "In 11 years of being their neighbor, I have never once seen that girl take her husband's side over her father's. Not once." She looked toward the pool where Sienna had rejoined her group, laughing at something on someone's phone. "Some people mistake loyalty for love. It isn't the same thing at all." I didn't answer. My jaw hurt from how hard I was holding it. Across the yard, Julian reappeared from the side of the house. He'd wiped his face, straightened his shirt. He walked back to the grill like a man returning to a post he hadn't chosen but couldn't abandon. He started checking the chicken. Victor glanced over at him from across the yard, said something to the man beside him, and they both chuckled. I stood up. I set the water glass on the empty chair beside me. I walked to Julian. "Hey," I put my hand on his shoulder from behind. He turned. His eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight in a way that meant they hadn't always been. "Dad, you don't have to. I'm going to head out," I said. "Early start tomorrow." Something moved across his face. Relief and shame so tangled together, I couldn't have separated them with a knife. "Okay." He cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming, Julian." I kept my hand on his shoulder and waited until he looked at me. "This isn't on you. You hear me? Not a single piece of this is on you." His throat worked. He nodded once, short and quick, the way a man nods when he doesn't trust what speaking might do to his face. I squeezed his shoulder and let go. I found Victor near the drink table refilling his beer. I walked straight to him. He turned when he heard me coming, and his expression shifted into the practiced smile he kept ready for occasions that required it. "Heading out already? Ray, I am." I stopped 2 feet from him. "Close enough. Thank you for the invitation, of course." "Of course." He clapped me on the arm once, the way men do when they're dismissing you. "Safe drive back." I looked at him for one long moment, looked him straight in the eye. "We'll talk again soon, Victor," I said. Something in my tone made the smile flicker. Just for a second, a small hesitation behind the eyes, the look of a man who has just heard a statement he can't quite categorize. Then the smile returned full wattage. "Anytime," he said. I walked to my truck without looking back. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off. For a long time, the sounds of the party carried faintly through the closed windows. Music, laughter, the ordinary sounds of a holiday afternoon. In my chest, something had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a decision that's already been made and is just waiting for the rest of you to catch up. My phone buzzed. Julian, a text. Sorry you had to leave early. Thanks for coming, Dad. My son apologizing to me for something done to him. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Then I started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and called Gideon. I didn't sleep. I tried. I lay down around 10, stared at the ceiling until midnight, moved to the couch, stared at that ceiling until 2, then gave up entirely and went to the kitchen. I made a pot of coffee I didn't need, and sat at the table in the dark, with my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. The house made its nighttime sounds around me, the furnace cycling on and off, the refrigerator's low hum, the creak of the third floorboard in the hallway that I'd been meaning to fix for 6 years and somehow never had. Beatrice used to say that creak was the house talking. Old houses have things to say. She told me once the kind of thing she said that I pretended to find silly, but actually wrote down somewhere in the back of my mind and never forgot. I looked at her photograph on the mantel. Beatrice had told me something 3 weeks before Julian, Unctie's wedding. We were in this same kitchen at this same table, and she was in the middle of a chemo week, the bad kind, the kind that made her hands shake and her appetite disappear completely, and she'd reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Ray, she'd said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it. I'm listening. I'd said I don't trust that family. She said it plainly without drama, the way Beatrice said everything that mattered. I can't explain it properly. It's not the money or the house or any of that. It's the way Victor Mercer looks at Julian. Like Julian is something he can use. She squeezed my hand. Promise me you'll watch out for our boy. I told her she was worrying too much. I told her the chemo was affecting her judgment, which was a terrible thing to say. And I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. She'd pulled her hand back and looked out the window and said, You'll see what I mean eventually, Ray. I just hope it's not too late when you do. I'd been replaying that conversation since I pulled out of Victor Mercer's driveway yesterday afternoon. Gideon knocked at 6:30, same as always, and let himself in through the back door. He took one look at me sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, with 4 empty coffee mugs lined up in front of me, and pulled out his chair without saying a word. I poured him a cup. He drank half of it before either of us spoke. How bad? He said, You're bad enough. I told him what happened. The tray, the sauce, Victor's voice, Julian on his knees. I told it flat without editorializing. The way you tell a thing when you're afraid that if you let any feeling into your voice, the whole structure of you will come apart. Gideon listened without interrupting. When I finished, he turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. Ray, he said, this isn't the first time. I looked at him. 2 months ago, Gideon said, Julian pulled up out front on a Sunday night. Must have been 11. I was on the porch. Couldn't sleep, bad back. You know how it is. His car sat in front of your house for 40 minutes. Engine off, just sitting there. Gideon looked at me steadily. He never came in. After 40 minutes, he started the car and drove away. The bottom of my stomach dropped somewhere I couldn't locate. You never told me that, I said. Didn't think it was my place. Gideon wrapped both hands around his mug. But I've been thinking about it since, and I think that boy drove 45 minutes to sit outside your house because he needed to be near something solid and he couldn't make himself knock on the door. He paused. That's not a man who's doing fine, Ray. That's a man who's disappearing. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw white spots. Then I dropped them to the table. What do I do, Gideon? You already know what you do. He said it quietly without hesitation, like a man who'd been thinking about this answer for a while. You call Clara Foster. Clara Foster had handled Beatrice's will and estate paperwork 3 years ago. Sharp, direct, no wasted motion. The kind of lawyer who explained things once clearly and expected you to keep up. Beatrice had liked her immediately, said she had honest eyes. What's Clara going to do about Victor Mercer? I said. I don't know yet, Gideon said. But what happened yesterday in that yard wasn't just a family argument, Ray. A man publicly humiliated your son and forced him to kneel on the ground. That's not nothing. And if there's more going on, if this has been building, Then you need someone who knows what they're looking at. I stared at the table at the grain of the wood worn smooth in the spots where Beatrice and I had rested our arms for 30 years. Beatrice told me, I said, 3 weeks before the wedding, she told me exactly this. Gideon didn't say anything. She put her hand over mine right here at this table, and she said she didn't trust. My throat tightened, and I told her she was overthinking it. Gideon reached across the table and put his hand on my forearm the way men our age do when words aren't going to cover it. He left it there for a moment, then pulled it back. Call Clara, he said. Today, I nodded. I stood up, looked at Beatrice's photograph on the mantel. I know, I said to her. You told me. Then I picked up my phone and realized there was something I needed to do before I made that call. Something I'd been avoiding for 3 years, sitting in a cardboard box at the top of my closet. The box had been sitting on the top shelf of my bedroom closet for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. I knew the exact count because I'd put it up there the morning after Beatrice's funeral when the house was still full of people bringing casseroles and flower arrangements, and I'd needed something to do with my hands that wasn't shaking them. I'd carried her things upstairs, set the box on the shelf, and told myself I'd go through it when I was ready. I was still not ready, but I pulled a chair from the hallway and climbed up for it anyway. The box was heavier than I remembered, or my arms were weaker, probably both. I carried it to the bed and set it down on Beatrice's side, which I still thought of as Beatrice's side, even though no one had slept there in 3 years. The bedspread was the same one she'd picked out at a home goods store in Columbus in 2019, pale blue with white stitching along the edges. She'd held up 3 different options and asked my opinion, and I'd said they all looked fine. And she'd said that was absolutely no help at all, and we'd laughed about it the whole drive home. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the box for a moment. Then I opened it. The smell hit me first. Something faint and specific that I couldn't name but recognized immediately as her. Not perfume exactly, just Beatrice. The particular combination of the hand lotion she used and the pages of the library books she was always returning late, and something else underneath that I had no word for. Only the knowledge that it belonged entirely to her and nowhere else in the world. My chest cracked open like a fault line. On top was the book she'd been reading when she went into the hospital the last time, a paperback mystery with a cracked spine and a bookmark still wedged in at page 212. She never found out how it ended. I picked it up and set it carefully aside. Underneath was a string of small wooden beads she'd worn every Sunday to church for 20 years. Her reading glasses with the tortoise shell frames, a photograph of the 3 of us, me, Beatrice, Julian, taken at Put-in-Bay on Lake Erie the summer Julian turned 16. We'd rented a golf cart and gotten completely lost, and Beatrice had laughed until she cried. Julian had his mother's eyes in that photograph. He still did. I set the photo on the nightstand and kept going. Near the bottom of the box, tucked between a folded cardigan and a small spiral notebook, I found the envelope. It was standard letter size, white unsealed. Julian? Unc? Y's name on the front in Beatrice's handwriting, the careful slanted print she used when something mattered, different from her quick everyday cursive. No stamp, no return address, just his name. My hands were not steady when I picked it up. I sat there for a long time with that envelope in my hands, turning it over. It was clearly a letter she'd written for Julian and never sent or never had the chance to send. The flap was folded in, but not glued. Whatever was inside, she hadn't considered it finished. I should have set it back in the box. It wasn't mine to read. I told myself that clearly and directly, and then I unfolded the flap and took out the single page inside. Her handwriting filled about 3/4 of the page. The date at the top was February 14th, Valentine's Day, 7 months before she died, during a period when she'd still been strong enough to sit at her desk in the mornings and write. Julian, she'd written. I don't know if I'll give this to you or if I'll decide it's better left unsaid. But I need to write it down because I'm running out of time to figure out the right moment. And I think the right moment may not come. You are the best thing your father and I ever did. I need you to know that before I say anything else. Not because of your degree or your job or anything you've accomplished, but because of who you are in the quiet moments when no one's watching. The way you check on your dad even when you're tired. The way you got on the floor to play with Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter at the block party last summer, because she was sitting by herself. And you noticed. That's who you are. I'm worried about you. I'm worried in the way that mothers worry when they can see something their child can't see yet because he's too close to it. The family you're marrying into, I want to be wrong about them. I'm trying very hard to be wrong, but something in me keeps saying that you are going to be asked to make yourself smaller than you are, to fit into a space that was never built for you. Please don't do that. Please don't get so used to making yourself small that you forget your actual size. Your father will watch out for you. He doesn't say much, but that man has never once in his life walked away from something that needed protecting. When things get hard, and I think they might let him help you, don't try to protect him from it. You're more alike than either of you will ever admit. I love you more than I know how to say, more than this page can hold. Mom, I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time. My face was wet, and I hadn't noticed when that started. I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes, one then the other, and breathed through my mouth the way I'd learned to breathe in hospital rooms. When keeping it together was the only option and falling apart had to wait. At the bottom of the box, tucked into the inside pocket of Beatrice's old planner, I found a small slip of paper, Clara Foster, a phone number, and in Beatrice's handwriting beneath it, 3 words, house keeps safe. I held that slip of paper between my fingers and looked at my wife's handwriting. She'd thought of everything. Even then, even when she was spending her energy on staying alive, she'd been thinking about what happened after and who might need protecting and how to make sure they were. Beatrice, I said to the empty room. My voice came out broken at the edges. What did you know that I didn't? The house creaked once, that third floorboard in the hallway settling in the morning heat. I folded the letter fully, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in my shirt pocket close to my chest. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Clara Foster. Clara Foster had her office on the 3rd floor of a red brick building on Jefferson Street in downtown Dayton, the kind of building that had been standing since the 1940s and intended to keep standing long after everyone currently in it was gone. No receptionist, no frosted glass with a logo, no leather chairs in the waiting area, just a short hallway, a wooden bench, and a door with her name on a plain brass plate. She opened it before I knocked. Mr. Kowalski. She stepped back to let me in. You sounded like a man who needed to come in today. Clara Foster was 54 years old, medium height, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt and carried herself with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where things mattered. Beatrice had said after their first meeting, "She doesn't waste a single word, Ray. I find that deeply comforting." I sat down across from her desk, which was covered in stacked folders and yellow legal pads, organized in a way that probably made complete sense to her and no one else. "Tell me what happened," she said. She opened a legal pad to a fresh page and picked up her pen. Not a laptop, not a recorder, just pen and paper. I told her all of it. The barbecue, the tray, Victor's voice, Julian on his knees, Sienna turning away. The text Julian sent afterward apologizing for something done to him. I kept it factual and in sequence the way I'd learned to give job site reports. Who, what, when, in what order, no editorializing. When I finished, Clara wrote something on her pad. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a folder. I recognized the same beige color as the materials she'd sent after Beatrice's estate was finalized. "Your wife came to see me," she said on March 14th of last year. My hands went still on the armrests. "She made an appointment under her maiden name, so there'd be no confusion with your family's existing paperwork." Clara opened the folder. She had 2 questions. The first was whether under Ohio law a daughter-in-law could compel the sale of a property co-owned or solely owned by a parent-in-law if the husband agreed to the sale. "Can she?" I said. "Not directly. In Ohio, your home is yours. Your son has no legal claim to it, and therefore his wife has no legal claim through him." However, Clara held up one finger. "If your son were to be listed as a co-owner on the property, or if you were to transfer any portion of the deed to him, his spouse could then petition for her share of that asset in a divorce proceeding." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Your wife wanted to make certain your name, and your name alone, was on that deed." "It is." Clara Foster leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight, and took off her reading glasses. She set them on the green blotter in the center of her desk and looked at me with the steady, unblinking eyes of a lawyer who had spent 30 years watching people try to steal things under the cover of the law. "Your wife was very clear, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic tone she used when explaining things that had no room for argument. "Beatrice came to see me in November of 2021. She didn't tell you because she didn't want you carrying the worry while you were still grieving her diagnosis, but she had been paying attention. She knew what Victor Mercer was doing with his contracting business, and she knew the kind of pressure Sienna was beginning to put on Julian. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 2103.02, dower rights still exist in this state. It's an old doctrine, one of the last in the country. But it's powerful. If Julian's name had been added to that deed as a co-owner, or if you had transferred even a fraction of the property to him during their marriage, Sienna would have immediately vested a dower interest in it. A life estate in 1/3 of the property that could not be defeated without her signature. If they filed for divorce, she could have petitioned the court for a partition sale, forcing the house to be sold on the courthouse steps to satisfy her share. Victor knew that. He's a former sheriff and a municipal contractor. He knows how to use the assessor's office to find properties with high equity and clean deeds. Your home was assessed at $340,000, entirely debt-free thanks to 40 years of your labor. It was a perfect target. She reached into a manila folder and pulled out a certified copy of the deed, sliding it across the desk toward me. "Your name, and yours alone, is on this title, Arthur. Beatrice made sure that when we structured the estate, the property was held in a life estate for you, with a subsequent transfer to a clean spendthrift trust for Penny, bypassing Julian's personal ownership entirely during his marriage. Sienna has zero legal interest in this house. Victor's IP address at Mercer Contracting was used to query this valuation file 7 times in the last 18 months, trying to find a crack in that trust. But Beatrice built this wall thick. She knew what was coming. She verified it with me and asked me to flag your file if anyone ever inquired about the property's ownership status." I pressed my back teeth together so hard my jaw ached. "What was her second question?" I asked. Clara set down her pen. She asked me whether it was possible that someone could be deliberately cultivating a relationship with her son for the purpose of gaining access to that property's value. She paused. I told her it was possible, but that I'd need more information to advise her further. She said she'd come back when she had more. Clara closed the folder. She never came back. She passed 8 months later. The room was very quiet. Through the window behind Clara's desk, I could hear the muffled sound of downtown traffic. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Dayton. People going places, the city moving on the way cities do. "Your home," Clara said carefully, "was assessed last year at $340,000. That's significantly above the neighborhood median. The reason is the 30 years of improvements you've made to the property, the additions, the renovation work, the structural upgrades, work you did yourself." She turned her legal pad toward me so I could see the number she'd written. "Victor Mercer has a professional relationship with the county assessor's office. His contracting company has done work on 2 municipal buildings in the last 4 years. He would have access to property valuation data that isn't publicly posted. Like he knew what my house was worth." I said I believe he's known for some time. I sat with that information. The way you sit with something that confirms what you already suspected but hoped you were wrong about. It didn't make me feel better to be right. It made me feel the way you feel when a doctor shows you an ex-Arthur and points to the thing you were afraid would be there. "What can you do?" I said quite a bit, actually. Clara picked up her pen again. "To start, I'm going to send a letter on your behalf to the county assessor's office requesting a full audit trail of anyone who has accessed your property's valuation records in the last 3 years. That's public information and they're required to provide it." She wrote as she talked. "I'm also going to draft a notarized declaration of your sole ownership that will file with the county recorder's office, creates a clear paper record that's harder to challenge later." "Is that enough?" Clara looked at me directly. "It's the beginning. What I need from you is information. Has your daughter-in-law ever asked about this house? Has anyone suggested you update your will to include your son or move assets into a joint account? My stomach dropped. The bank account, I said slowly. Julian and I have a small joint savings account. We set it up to cover household expenses when Beatrice was sick. I haven't looked at it in months. Clara wrote that down. Check it tonight. Check whether anyone other than you and Julian is listed as an account holder. She met my eyes. And Mr. Kowalski, I want you to bring me your son. Julian doesn't know I'm here, I know. Her voice was steady and direct, but he needs to. Whatever is happening in that marriage, he is in the middle of it, and he deserves to understand what's at stake. She closed her legal pack. Your wife came to me because she was trying to protect your family from something she could see coming. The least we can do is make sure her work wasn't wasted. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady in a way they hadn't since the morning Beatrice's doctor called. She knew, I said. Before any of this happened, she knew. She was a very perceptive woman. Clara stood and extended her hand. Bring me Julian and check that account tonight. I shook her hand, walked out into the hallway, stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, one hand on the railing, looking down at the ordinary lobby below. Beatrice had sat in that same chair across from Clara's desk, had asked those same careful questions, had written "housekeep safe" on a slip of paper and tucked it where I'd eventually find it. She'd been trying to hand me the tools before she left. Rye thought he was facing this alone. He had no idea what was waiting for him in an ordinary parking lot on an ordinary Thursday morning. Before I tell you who he found, comment the word "strong" so I know you're still with me. Note what follows includes fictionalized details woven in for depth and impact. If that's not your preference, this is a good place to step away. No hard feelings at all. The back gate latch had been sticking for 6 weeks. It was a simple fix. The pin had shifted, throwing the alignment off just enough that you had to lift and push at the same time to get it open. Which was fine when your hands were empty, and an inconvenience when they weren't. I'd bought the replacement hardware 3 weeks ago and left it on the workbench in the garage, which is what I did with small repairs when my head was somewhere else. The part sat there waiting until I ran out of excuses. Thursday morning, 4 days after Memorial Day, I drove to Ace Hardware on Morse Road to pick up the one bolt size I'd miscalculated. The store smelled the way hardware stores always smell: machine oil, lumber dust, something metallic underneath, and I'd been walking into places that smelled like that since I was 19 years old. It was one of the few places in the world where my shoulders came down automatically. I found the bolt I needed in aisle 7 and got in line at the register. 3 people ahead of me. The man directly in front was somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a plain gray polo shirt and carrying a small basket with a box of weather stripping and a package of wood screws. Average height, dark hair, going a little thin at the crown. Nothing about him registered as anything except another man running a Thursday errand. The cashier called out when she scanned his loyalty card. "Nathaniel Walsh, you've got a rewards balance. Want to use it today?" I went very still. Ruth Garner had pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand as I was leaving Victor's property on Memorial Day. I'd been so focused on getting to my truck that I'd shoved it in my jacket pocket without reading it. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table, I'd unfolded it and found a name and a phone number and Ruth's neat handwriting. Underneath, Sienna's first husband 4 years ago. If you need to understand what you're dealing with, find him. Nathaniel Walsh paid for his items and picked up his bag. I stepped out of line. I followed him through the automatic doors into the parking lot, feeling faintly ridiculous. A 67-year-old man in a hardware store parking lot following a stranger. He'd reached a dark blue Civic 2 rows over when I called out, "Excuse me, Nathaniel Walsh." He turned. His expression went neutral immediately, the careful neutral of someone who has learned to wait before reacting. "That's me," he said. "My name is Arthur Coleman." I stopped a few feet away, giving him room. "I'm Julian Kowalski's father." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the look of a man who has been half expecting a particular phone call for years and has just realized it arrived in a different form. "Is Julian okay?" he said. His voice was even, but the question came out fast. "Not entirely," I said. "No." He looked at me for a long moment, then he looked at his car, then back at me. "You want to sit down?" he said. We sat in the front seats of his Civic with the windows cracked, the parking lot noise filtering in carts, rolling a truck backing up, somewhere ordinary Thursday sounds. Nathaniel held his hardware bag on his lap and looked straight ahead through the windshield for a while, before he turned to face me. "How did you find me?" he asked. "A neighbor of the Mercer family, Ruth Garner." He nodded slowly. "Ruth." Something softened slightly in his expression. "She brought me a casserole when I moved out. Only person who did. She seems like that kind of woman," I said. "She is." He turned the hardware bag over in his hands. "What do you want to know, Mr. Kowalski?" "Whatever you're willing to tell me," I said. "I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here because my son has been in that family for 2 years, and I'm starting to understand that I don't know what I let him walk into." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Outside, a woman loaded groceries into the car beside us. Her kids arguing about something in the back seat. Normal Thursday, the whole world just going about its business. "I met Sienna at a work function," Nathaniel said finally. "She was smart and funny, and she paid attention to you in a way that made you feel like the only person in the room. We dated 8 months and got married." He paused. "I was 34. I thought I knew what I was doing. When did things change?" I asked. "They didn't change so much as reveal themselves." He said it carefully, like he'd thought about the exact wording before. "The first time Victor made a comment at dinner that was off, condescending about my job, my background, where I grew up, I laughed it off. Sienna laughed it off. I told myself it was just how he was." Nathaniel looked at his hands, but it kept happening. Every family gathering, every holiday, small things, then bigger things. And Sienna never once said anything. Not one time in 11 months did she tell her father to ease up. "Did you ask her to?" I asked her 3 times. His jaw tightened. The first time she said I was being too sensitive. The second time she said I needed to understand how her father expressed affection. The third time she cried and said I was trying to drive a wedge between her and her family. He exhaled slowly. "I stopped asking after that. What made you leave?" Nathaniel turned to look at me directly for the first time. His eyes were steady and tired in the particular way of someone who has processed something painful so many times. It no longer surprises him. "Victor called my school principal. He said I was teaching 8th grade history at the time." Victor called the principal, and without making any specific accusations, suggested that there were concerns about my temperament around children. Mentioned that there had been incidents he was aware of. Nothing specific enough to investigate, but enough to plant the idea. My hands tightened on my knees. "He did that," I said. "Not a question. My principal called me in, told me there had been an inquiry. She was decent about it. She didn't believe it. She made that clear, but she said she had to document the conversation." Nathaniel's voice stayed flat. "I requested a transfer to another district 2 weeks later. Victor won without ever saying anything provably false. And Sienna. Sienna said her father was just protective. He said it without heat, which was almost worse. She said he'd come around eventually. She said if I just gave it more time." He stopped, looked out the window. "I filed for divorce 4 months after the transfer. Sienna signed the papers without much argument, and I moved to the north side and didn't look back." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be." He looked at me with an expression that was complicated and honest. "I got out. Your son is still in it." He paused. "What is Victor doing to him?" I told him. The barbecue, the tray, the knees on the ground. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded once slowly like a man hearing a diagnosis he already knew was coming. That's escalation," he said quietly. "When I was there, it was comments, phone calls, pressure. What you're describing is worse." He met my eyes. "Mr. Kowalski, whatever you're planning to do it soon." We sat in that parking lot for another hour and 40 minutes. I know because I checked the time when I finally opened the car door to leave, and it was 22 in the afternoon. I'd pulled in at 12:40. The hardware store had cycled through 2 full waves of lunchtime customers and was quieting down toward the slow part of the afternoon, and neither of us had noticed. There's something else," Nathaniel said after a pause that had stretched long enough that I'd thought we were done. He was still looking through the windshield. His hands were flat on his thighs, now no longer moving. "Something I didn't tell you yet because I was still deciding whether to—" "Take your time," I said. He turned to face when I was doing research after the divorce, trying to understand what had happened, trying to put it in some kind of framework that made sense. I found another family here in the county about 8 years ago. What kind of family? A couple named Thorne. Richard and Evelyn Thorne over in Beaver Creek. Richard was a machinist, owned his property outright, good-sized lot. Old farmhouse, been in his family 2 generations. Nathaniel's voice was measured, factual. Victor's company did some contracting work near their property. Around the same time, a young man started showing up in Evelyn Thorne's life. Friend of a friend, the way those things start. He and Evelyn's daughter dated for almost a year, and the relationship ended. Within 8 months of it ending, Richard Thorne had signed over a right-of-way easement across the back quarter of his property to a development LLC. Nathaniel Cole opened a black notebook and turned to a page filled with neat, blocky handwriting. "It's a pattern, Arthur," he said, his voice flat and professional, the tone of an investigator who had spent too many years looking at the wreckage of small lives. "Victor Mercer doesn't change his tools because his tools have always worked for him. 10 years ago, Evelyn and Richard Thorne owned a 12-acre parcel on the west side of the county, right where the new bypass was scheduled to go. It had been in Richard's family for 2 generations, an old farmhouse, a couple of barns, nothing fancy, but it was sitting right in the path of the county's expansion plans. Victor's contracting company had just landed the municipal contract for the roadwork. Around that time, a young foreman working for Victor started showing up in Evelyn's daughter's life. He was polite, drove a nice truck, helped around the farm. He got close to the family, convinced Richard to list him as a co-signatory on a small agricultural loan to build a new equipment shed. Once that name was on the paperwork, Victor's company used the leverage of the debt to pressure the Thornes. They had code inspectors showing up 3 times a week, finding violations that didn't exist, assessing fines that the family couldn't pay. Within 8 months of the relationship ending, Richard Thorne was broke, his health was failing, and he signed over a right-of-way easement across the back quarter of his property to a development LLC registered to Victor's brother-in-law for pennies on the dollar. The county built the bypass. The LLC sold the remaining land to a commercial developer for a 600% markup, and the Thornes moved into a rental house in East Toledo. Richard died a year later. Victor Mercer knows exactly how to grind a family down until they're too tired to fight back. He was doing the same thing to Julian. Nathaniel looked at me. The LLC traced back to a holding company. The holding company had Doug Marsh's name on the original incorporation papers. My mouth went dry. "The Tildens didn't know," I said. "Richard Thorne thought he was signing a minor utility agreement." The language was buried in a 4-page document. His neighbor, who turned out to have a professional relationship with Victor's company, helped him fill out. Nathaniel shook his head. By the time Richard understood what he'd signed, the easement was recorded and legally binding. He consulted a lawyer. The lawyer told him it would cost more to fight than the land was worth. So Victor just took it. Piece of it, enough. Nathaniel turned back toward the windshield. "I don't know if he sent that young man deliberately or if it was coincidence. I've never been able to prove the connection, but the pattern fits. Your house, Mr. Kowalski, your son's marriage, it fits." I sat with that for a moment. The parking lot noise continued around us, indifferent, ordinary. Someone dropped something metal nearby, and it rang out sharp and clear against the asphalt. "Nathaniel," I said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead. Would you be willing to meet with my attorney? Tell her what you told me. The school, the principal, what you found about the Tildens." I kept my voice level. "Not a deposition, not a courtroom, just a meeting. What you know matters, and she needs to hear it from you directly." The silence stretched. Nathaniel looked at his hands again. "I've been afraid of Victor Mercer for 4 years, he said quietly. "I moved across town. I changed which grocery store I use. I drove a different route to work for 6 months because I was worried about running into someone connected to him." He exhaled long, slow, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. "I'm tired of being afraid of him." "You wouldn't be doing it alone," I said. "My attorney is Clara Foster. She's thorough and she's careful and she doesn't make promises she can't keep. And whatever happens, I'll be in that room." Nathaniel turned to look at me. Something had shifted in his expression. The careful neutrality from earlier had given way to something raw and more resolved. "Your wife," he said. "Dan Unk's mother. She passed 3 years ago." He nodded. "I'm sorry." He said it simply without elaboration, the way people say it when they actually mean it. Julian talked about her once when we were at a mutual friends thing before the wedding. He said she could read people better than anyone he'd ever known. Nathaniel looked at me steadily. I think she probably had Victor figured out a long time ago. My throat tightened. "She did," I said. Nathaniel picked up his hardware bag from the floor. He held it for a moment, then set it on the back seat. "Call your attorney," he said. "Set up the meeting. I'll be there." I shook his hand, a real handshake, the kind that means something, and got out of the car. I walked back to my truck and sat behind the wheel and called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. I found the witness. I said his name is Nathaniel Walsh. He was married to Sienna before Julian. Victor destroyed his career with a phone call, and he has information about a pattern going back 8 years. I paused. "He'll meet with you." Clara was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Bring him in Monday morning," she said 9 lights. Another pause. "And Mr. Kowalski, did you check the joint bank account?" My stomach dropped in the weight of everything Nathaniel had told me I hadn't checked. "Tonight," I said. "I'll check tonight." "Call me after," she said, and hung up. I sat in the Ace Hardware parking lot in the afternoon sun and thought about Richard and Evelyn Thorne in Beaver Creek, who had lost a piece of land that had been in their family for 2 generations because they trusted the wrong neighbor with a 4-page form. I thought about Nathaniel Walsh changing his grocery store and his driving route to stay out of the path of a man who had already moved on to the next target. Then I started the truck and headed home. Tonight, I would open the joint account. Julian and I shared and find out exactly how far in the Sienna had already reached. And whatever I found there would tell me whether what I was dealing with was careless or calculated. I already knew which one it was going to be. I got home at 3:15 and went straight to the kitchen drawer where I kept the paper bank statements. I'd never switched to online, only billing. Beatrice had set up the joint account with Julian back in 2021 when her treatments were making it hard for her to manage household bills easier. She'd said to have Julian able to cover things if she had a bad week. After she passed, Julian and I had kept it open. Neither of us had thought much about it. A few hundred in and out each month, nothing complicated. The statements were rubber banded together in the second drawer, most recent on top. I pulled out the last 3 months and spread them on the kitchen table under the overhead light. May, April, March. The account holders listed at the top of each statement were the same on all 3: Arthur T. Coleman, Daniel R. Kowalski, and a third name added in February that sat there on the page like something that didn't belong. Sienna M. Kowalski. I stood at the table and read it 3 times. Then I sat down in Ohio. Adding an authorized signatory to a joint checking account requires the written consent of all existing account holders. Either Julian had agreed to this and hadn't told me, or someone had found a way around that requirement. Either way, Sienna's name on this account meant she could access the fund's transfer money and in certain circumstances use the account's existence as evidence of shared financial interest in any assets connected to it. It wasn't a large account, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she'd done it without telling me, without anyone telling me. The account that Beatrice had opened to keep our family stable during the worst months of her illness now had a stranger's name on it. Added quietly in February 5 months ago while I was going about my ordinary life and noticing nothing, I called Clara. She picked up on the first ring. "It's there," I said. "February. Her name is on the account." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Don't touch anything in that account. Don't move funds. Don't close it. Don't add or remove anything. I'll file a request Monday morning to have the authorization change reviewed in Ohio. If the addition was made without proper dual consent, it can be challenged and reversed. This is actually helpful, Mr. Kowalski. It's documented evidence of intent." "Helpful?" I repeated. "I know how it feels," she said more quietly. "But yes, keep the statements. Bring them Monday." I hung up and sat at the table for a long time. The kitchen was cooling down as the evening came on. I hadn't turned the heat back up after the warm afternoon, and I could feel the temperature dropping the way Ohio evenings do in late May. That particular shift, That reminds you, winter was only recently gone and isn't entirely finished with you. My phone rang at 8:45. Julian's name on the screen. Hey, I said. Hey, Dad. His voice had that careful quality again. The one I'd been hearing more of lately, the walking on glass sound. You doing okay? I'm fine, you? Yeah, a pause that lasted a beat too long. Long week, Julian. I kept my voice even. Talk to me. He exhaled the sound of a man deciding something. I don't know where to start. Start anywhere. Another pause. Then I almost quit before I got married. Did you know that I almost called off the whole thing? His voice was quiet but steady. About 3 weeks before the wedding, Victor said something at dinner. I can't even remember exactly what it was now. Something about my salary, about what I could realistically provide for Sienna. And Sienna she laughed along with him. And I sat there thinking, this is what the rest of my life looks like. My chest hurt. What stopped you? Kit Lena cried, he said. That night, after dinner, she cried and told me her dad was just protective, that he didn't mean it, that he loved me in his own way, and I just needed to give him time. He paused. She looked so genuine, and I loved her dad, I really did. I know you did, son. She told me 2 months ago she was pregnant. His voice changed on that word, softened in a way that made my throat ache. I've been thinking about that baby every single day. Working harder, trying not to react when Victor says things, telling myself it's temporary. That once there's a child in the picture, everything shifts. He stopped. But something's been off. She hasn't mentioned a doctor's appointment, hasn't talked about anything, names, due dates, anything. And when I asked last week, she changed the subject. I gripped the phone tighter but kept my voice neutral. What are you thinking? I don't know, he said. I don't want to think what I'm thinking. His voice cracked slightly at the edges. But Dad, I called her OB's office today just to ask about scheduling. They have no record of her as a patient. The room went very still around me. Julian, I said carefully. I know. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I know what that probably means. I needed to say it out loud to someone before I figure out what to do with it. My son had been carrying that all day. Going to work, driving home, eating dinner, carrying the weight of something that would knock most men flat, and calling me at 8:45 when he finally couldn't hold it alone anymore. Come over. I said tonight, right now. Sienna's here, I can't just tell her you're going to check on your dad. Tell her anything, but come over, Julian. A long silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Okay, he said finally. Give me 30 minutes. He was there in 25. I heard his truck pull up before I saw his headlights through the kitchen window. He came in through the back door the way he'd come in his whole life and sat down at his usual chair at the kitchen table, the same chair he'd sat in since he was 8 years old, doing homework while Beatrice cooked dinner. He looked hollowed out, not broken. Julian had too much of his mother in him to break easily, but hollowed like something essential had been quietly removed and he was still running on what was left. I poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, sat down across from him, pushed 1 cup toward him. He wrapped both hands around it and stared into it like it had something to tell him. Dad, he said, what do I do? I looked at my son across the table that had held every important conversation of our lives together. First, I said, I need to show you something. I got up and got the bank statements from the counter, set them on the table in front of him, watched his eyes find the third name on the account. Di's face went through 3 distinct things in about 4 seconds. Confusion, then understanding, then a grief so clean and sharp it hurt to watch. She never asked me, he said. His voice came out flat. I never signed anything. I know, I said. Clara Foster is handling it. Julian looked up. You've already talked to Clara. I have, I said. And Julian, there are things I need to tell you about what I've been doing this past week. About what Clara found and about a man named Nathaniel Walsh. My son's eyes sharpened. The hollowed look shifted into something more alert. Tell me, he said. I talked for 2 hours. I told Julian everything Clara's office, what Beatrice had done 14 months before she died. The property valuation, Nathaniel Walsh, in the Ace Hardware parking lot, the Thorne family in Beaver Creek, the authorized signatory on our joint account. I laid it out in order the way I'd learned to present information on job sites. Clear sequence, no gaps, nothing left out. Julian listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup the whole time, but I don't think he drank from it once. When I finished, The kitchen was quiet in the way it gets late at night when the world has narrowed down to just the room you're sitting in. He put the cup down. "She planned this," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. The sound of a man landing on a truth he'd been circling without letting himself get close to it. "I think so," I said. "I think Victor planned it, and Sienna went along with it." "How long?" "Long enough that your mother saw it coming before you were even married." Julian pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes hard. When he dropped them, his eyes were red at the rims, but dry. He'd learned that from Beatrice. She cried in private and presented the world with clear eyes. And Julian had been watching her do that since he was old enough to understand what it meant. "I need a few days," he said, "to watch, to listen. Before I say anything to Sienna." He sat up straighter. "If she knows we know, she tells Victor. And right now, Victor doesn't know what you've been doing." He was right. Hearing it from Julian, the clarity of it, the steadiness made something ease in my chest. "You're not wrong," I said. He stood and picked up his jacket. Then he stopped and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Open, direct, very young. The face of the boy who used to come home from school and tell me things he hadn't told anyone else. "Daddy said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner about all of it. I kept thinking I could handle it on my own." He paused. "I was trying to protect you. The back of my throat burned." "I know," I said. "I was doing the same thing." He left at 11:15. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, then went to bed, and for the first time since Memorial Day, actually slept. 6 days passed. Julian texted regularly short, careful messages, telling me he was watching and holding steady. Clara confirmed the Monday meeting with Nathaniel had gone well. Gideon came for coffee twice, didn't push, just sat with me the way he always had. The ordinary machinery of daily life kept turning even while everything underneath it was shifting. On the 7th day, Julian called mid-morning. "Can Penny come over this afternoon?" he said. "She's been asking about you, and I just need a few hours, Dad." He didn't explain what the hours were for. I didn't ask. "Send her over," I said. Penny arrived at 1. With her pink rabbit backpack and a set of colored pencils she'd apparently decided needed to go everywhere with her. She came through the back door at full speed and wrapped both arms around my waist before I'd finished saying her name. "Grandpa Arthur, I missed you," she announced into my shirt. "I missed you too, Bug." I held on a moment longer than usual. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo Beatrice used to buy in bulk because it was Julian, Waxori's favorite as a kid, and the coincidence of that hit me somewhere behind the sternum. We settled at the kitchen table. Penny spreading her pencils out with the seriousness of a surgeon, laying out instruments me with my coffee, the late spring afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, that particular gold that made even the old linoleum look warm. She drew in concentrated silence for 20 minutes, tongue between her teeth, pencil moving with complete authority. I watched her and felt something in me slow down and breathe. Then she looked up at Grandpa Arthur. She said, "Is our house for sale?" My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. "What makes you ask that, Bug?" She went back to her drawing, talking the way 6-year-olds talk, as if what she was saying was no more significant than the weather. "Because I heard Mommy on the phone with Grandpa Victor. She said, your house is really pretty and it would sell for a lot of money." She frowned and selected a different pencil. "Are we going to move in with you?" "Because my bedroom at home has better light for drawing." My chest felt like something had reached in and squeezed it bare-handed. "Nobody's selling any houses, sweetheart," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Your Grandpa Arthur's house stays right where it is." "Good," she said, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. I sat across from my 6-year-old granddaughter and thought about Victor Mercer talking to Sienna about my house like it was already a transaction waiting to close. Thought about Beatrice writing house keep safe on a slip of paper. Thought about Nathaniel Walsh changing which grocery store he used because he was afraid. 40 minutes later, Penny held up her finished drawing. 4 figures standing in front of a house, herself, Julian, me, and beside me, a woman with long dark hair, her drawn hand touching mine. "Who is that?" I asked, though I already felt the answer. "Grandma Beatrice." Penny tilted her head like it was obvious. "Daddy says she's always with you, so I put her in the picture." She pushed the drawing across the table. "You can keep it," I looked at it for a long moment. Then I carried it to the living room and placed it on the mantel beside Beatrice's photograph. One in silver-edged black and white, one in a 6-year-old's colored pencil. Side by side, when I came back, Penny was already starting a new drawing. "Grandpa Arthur," she said without looking up, "can we have hot chocolate?" "We can have hot chocolate," I said. I put the milk on the stove, and the decision that had been forming in me since Memorial Day, slower than anger, colder than grief, more permanent than both, settled into place like the last piece of something, finally finding where it belonged. Julian knocked at 9:45 at night. Not the back door, the front door, which he almost never used. I heard it and felt something shift in my chest before I'd even stood up from the couch. Julian used the back door the way he'd used it his whole life, the way any person uses the entrance that means home. The front door was for strangers and people who weren't sure of their welcome. Something about that knock told me tonight was different. I opened it and he was standing on the porch in the dark jacket, zipped against the June chill hands in his pockets. Not the hollow look from the night after the barbecue. Something harder and more awake, like a man who had stopped waiting to be ready and simply decided to move. "Can I come in?" he said. "You never have to ask," I told him. He sat at the kitchen table, his chair same as always, and I put on coffee without asking. He unzipped his jacket, but didn't take it off like some part of him was still in motion, even sitting still. "I called Sienna's OB office again today." He said different receptionist. I told her I was calling to confirm my wife's upcoming prenatal appointment. He looked at the table. She checked the system twice. No patient by that name, current or historical. The coffee maker started its cycle. "Julian," I started. "I know," he said. "I've known for a few days. I just needed to hear it officially before I let myself believe it." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "She lied to me. There is no baby. There never was." His voice was steady. That scared me more than if he'd been shaking. "When I got home tonight," he continued, "Sienna was on the phone in the bedroom with the door closed. I was walking past to the bathroom. I heard her say, 'He's getting difficult, Dad. He's asking questions.' Then, 'I know, but we need more time.'" The coffee maker beeped. I didn't move. "More time," I repeated. To more time his jaw tightened. I went to the bathroom, came back out, told her I was going to check on you. She said okay without looking up from her phone. A short, dry laugh with nothing happy in it. That's how much I matter in that equation. I got up and poured the coffee, set his cup in front of him. He picked it up and held it with both hands the way his mother always had, warming his palms, and the similarity hit me so hard. I had to turn back to the counter for a moment before I trusted my face. "How long have you known about the house?" he said behind me. I turned around. "About a week." "How much has Clara found enough?" The account Nathaniel Walsh. What Victor did to a family in Beaver Creek, part of behavior going back 8 years minimum. Julian absorbed that. His coffee steamed untouched between his hands. "Are you going to be okay?" He looked at me directly. "Whatever this costs, the legal fees, all of it. Are you going to be okay?" My son sitting in the middle of his own disaster asking whether I was going to be okay. "Julian," I said, "I have been okay through 44 years of construction work and 23 years of raising you and 3 years without your mother. I am not going to fall apart over a lawyer's bill." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Mom would have known what to do from the start." He said she did know. I said she told me before the wedding. I didn't listen. "She told me too." He set the cup down carefully. "Not in words, but the last time I saw her in the hospital, she held my hand and said, 'You know your own worth, Julian. Don't let anyone teach you different.'" His voice came close to breaking on the last word. I thought I understood what she meant. I don't think I understood at all. We sat with that. The heater kicked on. The clock moved. "There's something else." He reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. "I found this in the desk in our bedroom tonight. It's a printout of your property assessment with notes in Victor's handwriting in the margin." I unfolded it. My address, the assessed value, $340,000, and in the margin in Victor's handwriting, spring timeline D to convince R, split after Julian to convince Rye, spent the proceeds after. My hands were completely steady. I'd expected rage. Instead, what I felt was something colder and more clarifying. A picture coming fully into focus after a long time of squinting at something blurred. He wrote this down, I said. He wrote it down. Dan, Unc, C's eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the intensity of someone who has been confused for a long time and has just had everything become painfully clear. What do we do with this? I refolded the paper, placed it flat on the table between us. We give it to Clara, I said. First thing tomorrow morning, and then you're going to need to make some decisions about Sienna. Not tonight. When you're ready. He nodded, picked up his coffee and drank, set it down. I was so sure I loved her, he said. Not quite to me, more to the room, to the version of himself that had stood at an altar 2 years ago and meant every word. I was so completely sure since you did love her, I said. That part was real. Whatever she was doing, that was real on your end. He looked at me across the table, my son 34 years old with his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and a life that was going to have to be rebuilt from the middle. Tomorrow, Clara, he said. Tomorrow, Clara, I agreed. He finished his coffee, zipped his jacket, and stood at the back door, the right door, the home door. He stopped and looked back. Thanks, Dad, he said. I'd go home and get some sleep, I told him. He almost managed a real smile. Then he was gone, and I sat at the table with Victor Mercer's handwriting in front of me and felt the last of my patience for waiting run completely dry. We were in Clara's office at 8:30 the next morning. Clara had said 9, but I'd called her at 7:15 and told her what Julian had found the property assessment print out Victor's handwriting in the margin D to convince R split after, and she'd said, come in at 8:30 instead. That told me she understood what kind of morning this was. Nathaniel Walsh was already there when Julian and I arrived, sitting across from Clara's desk with a cup of coffee and the composed look of a man who had spent 4 years getting ready for something and had finally shown up for it. He stood when we came in. Julian looked at him. You're Nathaniel Walsh. I am. Nathaniel extended his hand. You're Julian? Yeah. Julian shook it and held it a beat. I'm sorry about what happened to you. Nathaniel looked at him steadily. I'm sorry it happened to you too. Let's make sure it stops here. Clara came in 30 seconds later, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other, reading glasses already on. She looked at the three of us, pulled her chair out, and sat down without ceremony. All right, she said. Show me what you found. Julian put the folded printout on her desk. Clara unfolded it. Read it, write it again. Her expression didn't change, but she wrote something on her legal pad in the quick, decisive way she had. This is Victor Marsh's handwriting, she said to Julian. I've seen it on checks and documents for 2 years. Yes. And you found it in your home, a shared space you have legal access to. In the desk in our bedroom? Yes. Clara nodded and set the paper aside. Nathaniel, I've reviewed your statement from Monday. One more thing directly. The call Victor made to your principal. Do you have any documentation? Nathaniel reached into the folder he'd brought. My principal wrote me a memo documenting the inquiry, dated on school letterhead. He set it on her desk. She retired 2 years ago, but I have her contact information. Clara read it, wrote something, looked up. Shakeem, here's what we have, she said, leaning forward in the way she did when she shifted from gathering to deciding. A documented pattern, an unauthorized addition to a joint bank account, a property assessment with handwritten notations indicating intent to influence the sale of your home. She looked at me. A former son-in-law's testimony establishing prior behavior and reputational harm. A school administrator's memo confirming Victor Mercer made an unsubstantiated inquiry about a teacher's fitness. She paused. And a wife who told her husband she was pregnant when she was not, and who added her name to a financial account without proper dual consent. The room was quiet. Outside Jefferson Street was doing its ordinary morning business. What does that get us? Julian asked. Leverage, Clara said plainly. We are not taking Victor Mercer to criminal court. What he's done straddles the line of civil liability in ways that would make prosecution expensive and slow. What this evidence does is make Victor Mercer understand that continuing costs him significantly more than stopping. How? I said, we send him a letter not threatening, not accusatory, factual. We inform him that we hold documentation relating to an unauthorized bank account modification, a property valuation with handwritten notations indicating third-party intent to influence the sale of a private residence, and testimony from a previous family member regarding a pattern of targeted harassment. Clara picked up her pen. We make no demands. We don't threaten legal action. We simply inform him the documentation exists and is held by counsel, and we let Victor Mercer do the math. Julian leaned forward. That's it, just a letter. Victor Mercer spent 30 years as a county sheriff and 15 years as a contractor with municipal relationships. Clara said, he understands what it means when someone has documentation and has handed it to a lawyer. Men like Victor don't respond to confrontation. They respond to the cost-benefit calculation getting unfavorable. Nathaniel nodded from his chair. When I left, he let me go. Because pursuing me cost more than the value I represented. This is the same principle. What goes in the envelope besides the letter? I asked. Copies, Clara said. The bank statement, the property assessment printout, a one-paragraph summary of Nathaniel's statement enough to show it exists. She met my eyes, and one handwritten note from you, Mr. Kowalski. Brief, your own words. Keep it under 4 sentences. No threats. I picked up the pen she slid across the desk. I wrote, Mr. Mercer. I am a 67-year-old man who built everything I have with his own hands. I know what it costs, and I know what it's worth. I want my son and my granddaughter left alone. I believe you understand what I'm telling you. I put the pen down and slid the paper back to Clara. She read it, looked up. That'll do, she said. She spent 40 minutes assembling the package. Julian and Nathaniel, sat on either side of me while she worked, the three of us, quiet in the way people are quiet when something important is being done and words would only get in the way. When she sealed the envelope, she looked across the desk. Certified mail this afternoon. Return receipt. He'll have it by tomorrow. She looked at Julian. Be prepared for Sienna to know about it quickly. Whatever you need to do on your end, do it before she calls you. I know, Julian said. I've been ready for that conversation. Clara stood. We all stood. Mr. Kowalski, she said, extending her hand. Your wife was a smart woman. The smartest I ever knew, I said. I picked up my jacket and walked out of Clara Foster's office with my son on my left and Nathaniel Walsh on my right into the ordinary hallway of an ordinary building on an ordinary morning in Dayton, Ohio. The envelope was sealed. It was done. Now we waited. Waiting is its own kind of work. I'd learned that during Beatrice's illness, the hours in waiting rooms, the days between scan results, the discipline of keeping your hands busy and your mind from running too far ahead. You can't rush certain things. You can only make sure you've done everything within your reach and then stay steady while the rest moves at its own pace. I fixed the back gate latch the morning after we left Clara's office. Took 20 minutes. I don't know why I'd let it sit for 6 weeks. Victor received the certified letter on Tuesday, June 11th. Clara called to confirm the return receipt had come back signed. The envelope was in his hands. Whatever he did with that information was now his decision to make. Julian called me that evening. She knows, he said the moment I picked up. How did she take it? Quietly. She came home, sat down at the kitchen table, looked at me like she was deciding something. Then she said, My father got a letter today. I said, I knew. She said, From your attorney. I said, yes. He paused. Then she asked if I wanted her to leave. My hand tightened on the phone. What did you say? I said, I needed a few days to think. She nodded and went upstairs. We've barely spoken since. Another pause. Dad, I don't feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd be devastated. I'm just tired. I'm so tired of it. That's not nothing, I said. Tired means you've been carrying it long enough. Yeah, he said quietly. I think so. Wednesday. Gideon came for coffee. We sat on the back porch because the morning was clear and cool, and the maple was doing something beautiful with the early light. Gideon didn't ask about Victor or Clara or any of it. He talked about his daughter's new house in Cincinnati, a woodworking project in his garage, a documentary about migratory birds he'd found unexpectedly moving. I listened and drank my coffee and felt the specific relief of sitting next to someone who wasn't asking anything of you. You look better, Gideon said at one point. I feel clearer, I said, which was the closest I could get to the truth. Thursday, Clara called. The county assessor's office had responded to her records request. 3 separate accesses of my property valuation file in the past 18 months, all traceable to a single IP address registered to Mercer Contracting LLC. Is it enough? I asked. We're not building a criminal case, she said. We're building a picture, and the picture is very clear. Friday morning, Julian texted Sienna's moving out this weekend. Her choice, going to her aunt's place in Columbus. Penny stays with me. I read that standing at the kitchen counter and felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight since Memorial Day. Penny stays with me. Those 3 words. I texted back. You okay? He replied. Getting there. Penny asked if Mommy was going on a trip. I said yes. She said okay and went back to her drawing. Children, the resilience of them, the way they absorb enormous things and keep moving because they haven't yet learned they're supposed to stop. Saturday afternoon, Julian called again. His voice was different. Not the careful, measured quality of someone managing something, but something lighter. The way a room gets lighter when you open a window that's been painted shut for years. Troy called me, he said. Troy Mercer, the man who had stood at the edge of the yard on Memorial Day with a beer in his hand watching his father destroy someone and doing nothing about it. What did he want? I asked. He said he knew sorry wasn't enough, that he'd seen it happen before and hadn't said anything and wasn't proud of it. Di's voice was even, but I heard something underneath grief. Maybe for the version of his marriage he'd wanted it to be. He said his dad wasn't a good man and he'd spent his whole life pretending otherwise because it was easier. Then he asked if I was going to be okay. What did you say? I said I thought so, that I had my dad and my daughter and that was a good start. A pause. He said that sounded right. And then neither of us knew what else to say, so we said goodbye. I thought about Troy, his father's build, without his father's cruelty, standing in that yard, choosing not to act and living inside that choice for 3 weeks. Some people mistake cowardice for neutrality. Troy had probably been doing that his whole life. Good that he called, I said. So it didn't fix anything, Julian said. But it mattered anyway. That was Saturday. Sunday evening, I was at the kitchen table when my phone rang. Number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Mr. Kowalski, the man's voice, older, measured rough at the edges. I was at the Memorial Day cookout at the Mercer house. I stood 10 feet from you when Victor made your son kneel on that ground. I set my book down. I heard you, I said. I didn't say anything that day. His voice tightened. I've been living with that for 3 weeks. I won't tell you my name. I still have to do business in this county. And Victor Mercer has a long memory, but what happened that day was wrong, and I'm glad someone did something about it. A pause. Your son held himself well, under circumstances that would have broken most people. Another pause shorter. You raised him right, Mr. Kowalski. Thought you should hear that from someone who was in that yard. The line went dead. I sat in the Sunday evening quiet and held the phone. Outside, a lawnmower hummed 2 streets over. A dog barked once and went quiet. The particular stillness of a Sunday at dusk, in a place where people have been coming home to the same houses for 30 years. Tomorrow something was going to happen. I could feel it the way I'd learned to feel things on job sites. The air pressure change before weather moves in the silence, before something shifts. I washed my coffee cup and went to bed at 9. For the first time in weeks, I didn't lie awake. He came on Monday morning at 10:15. I was in the backyard, checking the garden bed. Beatrice had put in along the south fence tomatoes she'd started from seed every spring. A tradition I'd kept going, because stopping felt like losing one more piece of her. I heard a car in the driveway. Something in the quality of the sound, too deliberate pulling in too carefully, made me put down my trowel and go around front. Before whoever it was reached the door, Victor Mercer was standing at the end of my front walk. He'd come alone. No Troy, no lawyer, no company truck with the Mercer Contracting logo on the door. Just a dark green sedan and a man in khaki pants and a plain blue shirt who looked in the ordinary morning light of my front yard, considerably smaller than he had at his own house, surrounded by his own people on his own territory. He looked older too, 6 weeks since Memorial Day, and something had gone out of him, some quality of absolute certainty that had been running through him like a current. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had dimmed. We looked at each other across the front walk. Arthur, he said. Victor. I stepped back from the doorway. Come in. He hesitated just a moment, just enough for me to see it, then came up the steps and through the front door. I led him to the kitchen because that was where conversations happened in this house, where they had always happened. Whatever this was, it was going to happen at that table. He sat. I went to the coffee maker. Black, I said. Black, he said. I poured 2 cups and sat down across from him. Outside the window, the maple was moving in the morning breeze. The same maple Beatrice had planted 30 years ago when it was a sapling barely taller than Julian. I looked at it for a moment, then back at Victor. His hands were flat on the table, not wrapped around the mug, the hands of a man trying to look at ease and not quite managing it. "I read the letter," he said. "I assumed you did," I said. "A Clara Foster is thorough. Just observation, no inflection." "She is," I agreed. He looked up. His eyes were gray and direct and still carried some of that old authority, the eyes of a man who had spent decades having the final say in rooms. But there was something else in them now. The look of a man who has run the numbers and arrived at an answer he doesn't like. "What do you want?" he said. I let the question sit for a moment. "I want my son left alone," I said. "Him and Penny. No involvement from your direction. No phone calls, no pressure, no opinions about decisions that aren't yours to make." I kept my voice level. "That's what I want." Victor turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. "And the documentation your lawyer has that stays with Clara as long as it needs to. If Julian and Penny are left alone to rebuild their lives, then there's no reason for any of it to go anywhere." "You're not asking for money," he said. "I don't want your money, Victor." I let that land. "I never wanted anything from you except for you to treat my son like a human being. You didn't do that, so now we're here instead." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked. The maple shifted outside. "Troy told me he called Julian," he said. His voice had changed slightly, not soft but less armored. "Julian mentioned it. Troy is not like me. He said it simply like a fact he'd spent a long time making peace with and hadn't entirely managed. He never was. I used to think that was a problem. I'm not sure anymore." I didn't answer that. It wasn't my job to make Victor Mercer feel better about his son. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a folded document, set it on the table, and slid it across to me. "So, Clara Foster told me this morning what she needed to see before any conversation could happen," he said. "I had 2 hours. I unfolded it. A notarized authorization, removing Sienna's name from my joint bank account with Julian's signed witness dated that morning. Beside it, a second document, a written statement relinquishing any claim or interest in the property at my Clover Street address, signed by both Victor and Sienna. I read both carefully. Then I set them down. "I'll have Clara verify these," I said. "That's fine." Victor picked up his coffee for the first time and drank. "Sienna's not a bad person," he said quietly. "She got raised wrong. That's on me." I looked at him across the table. 61 years old, silver-haired, sitting in my kitchen with his hands flat and nothing left to control. "I can't tell you whether Sienna is a good person," I said. "What I know is that Julian loved her genuinely, and she let him do it, while helping herself to whatever she could reach. What you do with that is your business." He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a verdict. He stood, picked up his jacket, and looked around the kitchen at the cabinets I'd built at Beatrice's photograph visible through the doorway. Something moved across his face that I didn't try to read. "You built all this yourself," he said. "Most of it," I said. He looked at it one more moment, then it shows. He walked to the front door and let himself out. I heard his car start back out and drive away, until the engine blended into the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood and disappeared. I sat at the table with 2 signed documents and a half-full cup of coffee and the sound of the maple moving outside. Then I picked up my phone and called Clara. "He came," I said. "I know," she said. "He called my office this morning before he came to you. He asked what it would take to make this go away quietly. I told him to go talk to you first." A pause. "He brought signed paperwork." "He did. I'll need to see it. But Ray, I think it's over." I looked at Beatrice's photograph on the mantel, her smile in that cream-colored dress. The laugh caught mid-breath. The face of a woman who had seen this coming before anyone else and had quietly, carefully laid every stone of the path I just walked down. "Yeah," I said. "I think so too." November 2024 in Ohio had a particular quality of light. Not the sharp gold of October or the flat gray of December, something in between, a pale, clean brightness that came in low through the windows and made everything look deliberate, like the world had slowed down enough to look at itself clearly before winter arrived and covered everything up. I was at the stove at 7:30 when I heard Julian's truck in the driveway, eggs in the cast-iron pan. Beatrice had bought at an estate sale in 1993 bacon from the butcher on 5th Street, thick cut, the kind that fills the whole kitchen before it's halfway done. Sourdough from the bakery 2 streets over, coffee already made and hot. 5 months had passed since Victor Mercer sat across from me at this table with his hands flat and his certainty dimmed. 5 months since Clara had said, "I think it's over." And I'd looked at Beatrice's photograph and agreed. The divorce had been quiet. Sienna signed everything without much argument, the same way Nathaniel Walsh had described it years before. She took what the settlement allowed and moved on. Julian let her go without anger, which told me everything I needed to know about where he'd arrived. About 3 weeks after Sienna moved out, Penny had asked Julian if Mommy was coming back. Julian texted me about it that night, how he'd sat down on the floor right where he was standing, held his daughter close, and told her that Mommy loved her, and that some things change, but that never would. Penny had listened carefully. Then she'd asked if she could have a grilled cheese sandwich. Julian made her one. I read that text at the kitchen table and felt something I could only describe as gratitude for the specific, ordinary resilience of a 6-year-old who could hold sadness in one hand and a grilled cheese in the other. The back door opened. Penny came through first, as always, at full speed. Grandpa Arthur. Both arms around my waist, face pressed into my back. "It smells so good in here. Bacon will do that. Go wash your hands. They're clean. Go wash them anyway." She went footsteps loud in the hallway, and Julian came in behind her. He looked good, not the performed fine I'd been watching him hold together for months. Actually good, collar in his face, shoulders settled, moving through my kitchen like a man who knew exactly where he was. "Morning, Dad." He poured himself coffee without asking. The way he'd done his whole adult life. "You sleep okay?" "Better than I have in months." Penny woke me up at 5:30 to tell me she dreamed about a horse. He said it the way a man says something when his life has finally returned to a size he can carry. Normal Saturday, I laughed. A real one. We ate the way we used to, Penny doing most of the talking, Julian and I exchanging looks over her head. The conversation moving from school to a bird she'd seen in the yard to a complicated situation between 2 classmates. She explained with the gravity of a UN mediator. After the plates were cleared, Penny took her colored pencils to the living room. Julian and I stayed with our coffee. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," he said. "Work, where I live, all of it. What are you thinking?" "I want to find something closer to here." He wrapped both hands around his mug the way Beatrice always had. "Not because I need you to look after us. Because Penny should know her grandfather. Because mornings like this should happen more than they don't." He looked at me steadily. "I spent 2 years letting myself get pulled further from everything that was actually mine. I don't want to do that anymore." My throat tightened. "That sounds right," I said. I got up and went to the kitchen drawer. Not the one with the bank statements, the other one with the things I kept, because I couldn't throw them away. The envelope had been waiting there since the morning I'd found it in Beatrice's box. I set it on the table in front of him, his name on the front, her handwriting. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "Is this from Mom?" "She wrote it before she passed." I said, "I've been holding on to it." He picked it up carefully, the way you handle something that might not survive rough handling. He turned it over. His jaw worked once quietly. "I'm going to read this tonight," he said after Penny's asleep. "Is that okay? It's yours. Read it whenever you're ready." He put it in his jacket pocket close to his chest. From the living room, Grandpa Arthur, "Come see what I drew." Penny held up the drawing with both hands. It was the backyard, the maple tree drawn big and full in the center of the page, the way it looked in late spring before the leaves turned. Beneath the tree she'd drawn a bench, 2 people sitting on it. "Who's that?" I asked. She pointed to the smaller figure. "That's you." "And the other one?" She picked up a brown pencil and added a few more strokes to the second figure's hair. "Grandma Beatrice," she said without looking up. "She sits with you sometimes," Daddy said. I looked at the maple tree. She'd drawn every leaf a different shade of green, the way only a child would think to do it. "Can I keep this one too?" I asked. "I made it for you," she said, like it was obvious. I carried it to the mantel and set it beside her drawing from the summer. The one with all 4 of us standing in front of the house. 2 pictures now side by side, Beatrice in silver and black, Beatrice in colored pencil, both looking into the same room. Outside, the maple was dropping its last leaves across the lawn. In the mailbox was a small card with no return address. One line inside in handwriting I didn't recognize. Thank you for not giving up. Your son is lucky. So is she. No signature. I didn't need one. I placed it on the mantel between Beatrice's photograph and Penny's drawing. From the kitchen, Julian called, "Dad, you want more coffee?" "Yeah," I said. "I do." I took one last look at the mantel, the photograph, the drawing, the small card, and walked back to the kitchen where my son was pouring coffee and my granddaughter was drawing horses, and the bacon smell still hung in the warm air of the house that Beatrice and I had built together. The house that nobody was ever going to take away.